When you hear the word Arabia, your mind probably jumps straight to Islam. And that makes sense. It was the single most powerful force in the region's history, forging an empire that changed the world. But what about the world that came before? The Arabia that existed right on the edge of this massive transformation was a complex, fascinating, and often really violent place that absolutely set the stage for everything that came next. So, what was it really like? That's the big question, right? We're going to dive into the social, political, and religious landscape of an era the Arabs themselves later called the Jahiliyyah, or the Age of Ignorance. It's a journey into a world that was on the brink of being changed forever. All right, so first things first, for most people living in pre-Islamic Arabia, your entire world, your identity, your safety, your future, it all came down to one thing: your tribe. Out in that vast, unforgiving desert, the nomadic Bedouin tribe was the absolute foundation of society. And when I say everything, I mean everything. You gotta remember, there was no central government, no police force, no national army to call on. Your tribe was your nation, your family, and your only real guarantee of safety. Loyalty wasn't to a king or a country, it was to your kin. Your very survival depended on it. Now, this tribal structure had a pretty stark reality. It was intensely patriarchal. Men held all the power. They inherited property, they were the leaders, and they could have as many wives as they wanted. For women, though, life was incredibly fragile. They had almost no rights, couldn't own property, and in tribal conflicts were often treated just like prizes of war. Sadly, the practice of female infanticide also happened, because some families just saw daughters as an economic burden. So, with no police and no courts, how did you get justice? Well, it came down to a brutal, simple equation: blood for blood, life for life. If someone from another tribe hurt one of your people, your entire tribe was honor-bound to get revenge. And that, as you can imagine, created a constant, relentless cycle of violence.
This wasn't just random revenge. It was a core concept, and it had a name: Thar. It was seen as a sacred duty, a matter of profound honor. This idea was the bedrock of the whole social order. On one hand, it was supposed to protect the tribe by making attackers think twice. But on the other hand, it just fueled constant, simmering warfare across the entire peninsula.
Okay, so it wasn't all just nomadic chaos in the desert. Amidst this tribal landscape, cities started popping up, like these islands of order and trade, and urban centers, especially places like Mecca and Yathrib, started to change the whole game. Now, at the heart of the most important city, Mecca, was the Kaaba. Long before it became Islam's holiest site, it was this hugely important pagan sanctuary. And get this, it housed around 360 different idols, each one representing the various gods of tribes from all over Arabia. It was kind of like a spiritual United Nations for the peninsula. And that religious significance led to something absolutely incredible: an annual pilgrimage truce. For a sacred period every year, tribes would put down their weapons and travel to Mecca. All the fighting just stopped. This truce was crucial. It meant people could trade safely, they could settle debts and arguments, and it's where a shared Arab culture really started to take shape. So Mecca becomes this unique powerhouse. It's got a dual role. It controls the vital trade routes, the economic lifeblood of the region, and it's the undisputed religious center, a spiritual magnet for everyone. Think about that combination. It created a space where bitter rivals had to interact peacefully. It allowed for an exchange of not just goods, but also ideas in a way that was totally unthinkable anywhere else. It connected those isolated desert tribes to each other and to the great empires beyond. Now, we've talked about all those pagan idols in the Kaaba, but don't get the wrong idea. The spiritual world of pre-Islamic Arabia was way more diverse than that. It was a true crossroads of belief systems, a real tapestry of faiths. So if you look at the breakdown, Arab polytheism, the worship of many local gods and spirits, was definitely the dominant belief system, but it was far from the only game in town. I mean, look at this. You had significant, well-established communities of Christians and Jews right alongside other monotheistic movements that were starting to bubble up. And these different faiths were flowing in from all directions. Polytheism was the local, homegrown, tribal thing. Christianity was coming in from the big empires, the Byzantines to the north and Ethiopia to the south. And Jewish communities had been there for centuries, especially in cities like Yathrib, which would later become Medina. And one powerful kingdom in the south even adopted it as their state religion. And then there's this really fascinating group, the Hanafi. These were native Arab monotheists. They completely rejected the idols of the polytheists, but they didn't really fit in with the Jewish or Christian communities either. They were trying to follow what they saw as the original, pure faith of Abraham. And Islamic tradition says that several key figures from the early days of Islam were actually part of this movement. So we've seen a world of tribes and cities. But what about larger states? Were there any attempts to actually unite Arabia under a single ruler? Well, yeah, there were. Several powerful kingdoms existed, but they were often caught up in the politics of the era's superpowers. You can basically see two different models of how to run things. Down in the south, in what's modern-day Yemen, you had more organized, centralized monarchies, like the famous Himyarite kingdom. But up in the north and the center, power was much more decentralized. It was all about tribal confederations and city-states run by powerful clans, like the Quraysh tribe in Mecca. The story of that southern Himyarite kingdom is just wild. I mean, look at this timeline. In the 4th century, they move away from polytheism. By the late 5th century, their king officially converts to Judaism. But this leads to major religious conflict. A later Jewish king started persecuting Christians, which then triggered a massive invasion from the Christian kingdom of Aksum in Ethiopia. They conquered the Himyarites, and that was the end of their reign. It's a perfect example of how global politics and religion were already shaping Arabia's fate. And up in the north, you had other big players, like the Lakhmids and the Ghassanids. But here's the catch. They weren't fully independent. They were essentially client states, acting as buffers caught in a constant tug-of-war between the two great rival superpowers of the day, the Persian Sasanian Empire and the Byzantine Roman Empire. So, what does this all add up to? Well, pre-Islamic Arabia was a land of deep, deep contradictions. On one hand, it was completely fragmented by tribal loyalty and that endless cycle of blood feuds. But on the other, things like a common language, a shared love of poetry, and that centralizing pull of the pilgrimage to Mecca, they all provided the seeds of a shared identity. At the end of the day, though, despite all its cultural richness and economic energy, the land was defined by disunity and constant conflict. As the historian Gustav A. von Grunebaum so perfectly put it was a situation of tribal guerrilla warfare all against all. And that brings us to the final critical question. In a world so fundamentally shattered by blood feuds, by competing religions, and by fierce tribal independence, what kind of idea, what kind of person, what kind of message could possibly be powerful enough to overcome all of that and actually unite it?